It's a rather mind-bending idea to consider, isn't it? That nuclear weapons, these instruments capable of just, well, unimaginable destruction, are also seen by some as the ultimate guardians of peace.
It really is a profound paradox. And that tension, between the sheer destructive power and the pursuit of stability, that's what makes this so critical. We're talking about the highest possible stakes here.
Absolutely. And the source he sent over, Akhilesh Dwive's paper on India's nuclear doctrine, it's a fantastic way in. So our mission today really is to get under the skin of this for you.
To unpack it.
Exactly. Extract the core principles, see how it evolved, pinpoint the challenges, but keep it clear, engaging. Focus on what's most important.
Right. Think of it as a focused briefing. We'll start with the journey, India's path to becoming nuclear.
Okay.
Then look at the doctrine itself, first use, that kind of thing, how it stacks up against others.
And the debates, too.
Oh, definitely. The debates, the strategic puzzles India is facing right now.
Okay, so let's start there, at the beginning. The paper really stresses that India's entry wasn't sudden or, aggressive, more gradual, reluctant even.
Precisely. In the early days, post-independence under Nehru, the focus was squarely on peaceful uses, atomic energy for development for progress.
Science for nation building.
Yes. But even then, there was this sort of background awareness, a quiet understanding that, well, if push came to shove, these technologies could have security applications down the line.
And it seems the 1962 war with China was a real turning point, a kind of wake-up call.
Without a doubt. That conflict, it starkly exposed India's conventional vulnerabilities. And then, just 2 years later, 1964, China tests its first nuclear weapon. That just fundamentally altered the strategic equation in Asia.
Leaving India feeling potentially vulnerable.
Extremely vulnerable. Vulnerable to nuclear coercion, potentially.
Which feeds into why India consistently refused to sign the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They saw it as unfair.
Deeply unfair. Inherently discriminatory. That was the view. It basically created, a permanent club of 5 nuclear haves, and everyone else was a have-not.
Locking them out.
Right. Freezing the status quo in a way that didn't address India's security needs. They often called it nuclear apartheid.
And it wasn't only China driving this. The paper mentions the 1971 Bangladesh War and perceived U.S. nuclear signals.
Correct. During that war, the deployment of the U.S. 7th Fleet, led by the U.S. Enterprise, into the Bay of Bengal. Well, that was widely seen in India as a deliberate nuclear signal.
Gunboat diplomacy, nuclear style.
Sort of. A message. And it really solidified the belief in Indian strategic circles that maybe having their own nuclear capability was essential to avoid being subjected to that kind of pressure again.
So all these factors build up leading to the 1974 Pokhrani test, but they called it a peaceful nuclear explosion, which sounds careful.
Extremely careful. It demonstrated the capability, no question. They could build and detonate a device, but the peaceful label was key.
Signaling ambiguity.
Exactly. For the next, nearly 25 years, India maintained this posture. No declared weapons program, but not renouncing the option either. It's often called the recessed deterrent phase, meaning they had the parts, the know-how, but not necessarily assembled weapons ready to go. They could gear up if needed. Strategic ambiguity was the name of the game.
Fascinating balancing act. So what finally tipped the balance towards overt testing in 98? Poker in a second.
A convergence of factors, really. The NPT being extended indefinitely in 95 reinforced that sense of discrimination.
Okay.
Then the negotiations for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, felt like another attempt to box India in permanently.
Closing the door.
And perhaps the biggest driver was growing concern about China-Pakistan nuclear and missile cooperation. That nexus was becoming increasingly worrying. Put all that together with a government willing to take the step.
You get poker in 2 seconds, 5 tests. A much clearer statement.
Oh, absolutely. Prime Minister Vajpayee's announcement right after left no doubt. India was now a declared nuclear weapon state. End of ambiguity.
Though he did stress it wasn't aimed at anyone specific, right?
No.
And reaffirmed no first use.
He did. Important qualifiers.
Yeah.
But the core message was undeniable. India had crossed the threshold.
And the world reacted strongly at first. Sanctions.
Yes, initially there was significant condemnation, sanctions from the U.S. and others. It was a major diplomatic challenge.
But India pushed back diplomatically. The paper mentions the Jaswantha Singh Strobe Talbot talks.
Crucial dialogues. They were absolutely instrumental. India laid out its security rationale persistently at a high level. Over time, especially with the U.S., this led to a more, let's say, pragmatic understanding.
And acceptance, almost.
A de facto acceptance, yes, recognizing India's reality outside the NPT. This eventually led to the big U.S.-India civil nuclear deal in 2005.
Okay, so that whole history brings us to the doctrine itself. Drafted in 99, formalized in 2003. What are the absolute core pillars?
Right. Pillar number one, the most famous perhaps, is no first use, NFU.
The pledge not to start a nuclear war.
Exactly. India says it will only use nuclear weapons in retaliation. Retaliation against a nuclear attack on its territory or its forces, anywhere.
That's a big commitment, especially compared to some others. But you mentioned an exception in the paper. Biological or chemical weapons?
Yes, that's a really important nuance. The NFU pledge has this rider. India reserves the right to retaliate with nuclear weapons if it's first attacked with biological or chemical weapons.
So WMD for WMD, essentially.
That seems to be the logic, covering the whole spectrum of weapons of mass destruction. It's also worth noting, while NFU is official policy, there's always been some internal debate, calls to revise it, make it more ambiguous maybe.
Like those comments from Parakar or Rajnath Singh.
Exactly. But officially, NFU remains the stated posture.
Okay. Pillar 2. Credible minimum deterrence. What's the essence of that?
It means having the smallest possible arsenal that can still inflict unacceptable damage on an attacker. The key word is credible.
Not just numbers.
Not just numbers. It's about quality. Survivability, can it ride out a first strike? Reliability, will the weapons work? Effectiveness, can they reach the target? And minimum isn't static.
It changes.
It's dynamic. It depends on what potential adversaries are doing, their capabilities, their defenses. It's about having just enough, but ensuring that enough is truly believable as a deterrent.
Right. And then pillar 3, massive retaliation. That sounds blunt.
It is blunt. The doctrine says if deterrence fails, if India is hit first with nuclear weapons, the response will be massive, designed to inflict unacceptable damage.
Leave no doubt.
The goal is maximum deterrence. Make any potential first strike unthinkable because the consequences would be catastrophic for the attacker, no matter how small the first hit might be.
But that's also where some criticism comes in, right? The credibility of going massive for a limited strike.
Exactly. That's a major point of debate. We can circle back to that.
Okay. And pillar 4, crucial. Civilian control.
Absolutely fundamental. India has a two-tier nuclear command authority, the NCA. At the top, the political council, headed by the prime minister. They, and only they, can authorize nuclear use.
The final decision rests there.
Unequivocally. Below that, the executive council, led by the national security advisor, provides inputs, options, and executes the political council's decisions.
And the military.
The military, through the Strategic Forces Command, SFC, manages the assets day to day and carries out the operational orders. But the launch decision itself, purely civilian political leadership.
Clear chain of command. And the last element you mentioned ties it together, strategic restraint.
Yes, this sort of overarching posture. Beyond the operational bits, India frames its doctrine within a commitment to restraint.
Like the testing moratorium.
Yeah, exactly. The unilateral halt on testing since '98. Also, strong pledges against transferring weapons or technology, strict export controls. And of course, India's long-stated goal of global nuclear disarmament.
It's that idea of minimum deterrence with maximum restraint.
You got it. That phrase, often associated with K. Subramaniam, really captures the essence, balancing the need for deterrence with being a responsible nuclear power.
Okay, so those are the pillars for India. How does this whole approach look when you put it side by side with, say, Pakistan or China? Big regional players.
The contrast with Pakistan is stark. Very stark. Pakistan explicitly maintains a first-use option.
The opposite of NFU.
Right. They reserve the right to use nuclear weapons first, potentially even against a large-scale conventional attack if they feel their existence is threatened.
A much lower threshold.
Arguably, yes. And they talk about full-spectrum deterrence, which includes developing tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, again suggesting a lower threshold for use. This asymmetry creates real challenges for stability.
Forces India to focus on survivability.
Absolutely. India's retaliatory stance requires its forces to survive a first strike. Pakistan's doctrine puts pressure on that.
And China, they also have an NFU policy, don't they?
They do, officially. That's a similarity. And they also talk about minimum deterrence.
Oh.
But the differences are significant too.
Like?
Well, China's arsenal is considerably larger, more advanced technologically.
Right.
And there's much less transparency about their actual force size, posture, and deployment. That opacity complicates things for India.
Makes it harder to define India's own minimum.
Exactly. What's minimum when facing a neighbor with a larger, less transparent arsenal?
And compared to the US or Russia, a whole different ballgame.
Generally, yes. Historically, the U.S. and Russia have maintained doctrines allowing for flexible response, including potential first use in certain scenarios, maybe even against massive conventional or WMD attacks.
More options on the table.
More options, much larger, more diverse arsenals, and parts of their forces are kept at higher states of readiness than India's generally more relaxed peacetime posture.
Okay, so these comparisons really highlight the unique pressures on India, which naturally leads to debates and criticisms about India's doctrine, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. That NFU policy, as we touched on, is constantly debated internally.
The argument being it ties India's hands.
That's one side. Some argue it gives adversaries, especially Pakistan, too much leeway, knowing India won't strike first. They suggest ambiguity might be better. Maybe hint at preemption.
To deter conventional aggression.
Potentially. The idea is that a credible threat of nuclear use, even early on, might make Pakistan think twice about starting a conventional conflict that could escalate.
But the counter-argument
is that ditching NFU would be destabilizing. It could lower the nuclear threshold for everyone, increase arms racing pressures, and make crises much more dangerous.
And the massive retaliation part gets criticized too, for not being believable against a smaller attack.
Yes, that's the credibility gap argument. If, say, Pakistan used a single, low-yield tactical nuke against troops in a border skirmish, would India really retaliate with a massive strike against Pakistani cities?
Knowing that could invite massive retaliation back.
Precisely. Critics argue it's not a credible threat in limited scenarios, which could actually make those limited scenarios more likely. It leads to calls for more flexible, perhaps proportional response options.
That stability-instability paradox again. Nukes prevent big wars, but maybe encourage smaller ones.
That's the core idea. Nuclear weapons might deter all-out war, but by doing so, they potentially make lower-level conflicts seem safer to initiate, raising the risk of miscalculation and unintended escalation.
Survivability is another big concern mentioned. Making sure the second strike is actually possible.
It's paramount. If your doctrine is based on retaliation, you must be able to absorb a first strike and hit back effectively. So there are ongoing questions about the vulnerability of land-based missiles, especially as technology improves.
Things like missile defense or better targeting.
Yes, ensuring the sea-based leg, the submarines, are truly undetectable and continuously available, and that the air-based systems can penetrate defenses. It requires constant vigilance and investment.
And the paper also talks about ambiguities in the doctrine itself, things not fully spelled out.
Right. Concepts like credible minimum, how minimum is minimum, or unacceptable damage, what's the precise threshold, these aren't explicitly defined.
Is that deliberate?
Sometimes ambiguity can be strategically useful, keeping adversaries guessing, but it can also create problems for your own planners and decision makers in a crisis. What about attacks on allies? What's the exact trigger for nuclear retaliation against CBW use? These aren't fully fleshed out publicly.
Okay. So, to guarantee that credible minimum deterrence, India's been building its nuclear triad. Land, air, sea. Let's look at the tech. Land-based first. The Agni missiles.
Yes, the Agni series is the backbone. Starting with Agni, shorter range, mostly seen as Pakistan-centric, then progressing through 334 up to Agni-V, which is an ICBM intercontinental ballistic missile.
Bringing China fully into range.
Definitely. And there's talk of Agni-6, potentially with MIRVs.
MIRVs, explain that.
Multiple, independently targetable re-entry vehicles. Basically, one missile carries several warheads, each capable of hitting a separate target. It makes defense much harder.
Increases the punch.
Significantly. And they're focusing on survivability too, road and rail mobile launchers, putting missiles in canisters for faster launch and better protection.
And the air leg. Started with older planes.
Initially, yes, modified Mirage 2000s and Jaguars, but it's been upgraded. The Su-30 MKI is a key platform now, more range, bigger payload, and the new Rafale jets add a lot of capability.
Better ability to get past defenses.
Yes, advanced avionics, penetration aids, plus air-launched cruise missiles like BrahMos, maybe Nirapay variants, give standoff capability launch from safer distances. Air power offers flexibility, even if planes are inherently more vulnerable than subs.
Right. Which brings us to the sea-based leg, the submarines, often seen as the ultimate guarantor.
That's the strategic thinking, yes. The most survivable part of the triad. Commissioning INS Ariane, the first indigenous nuclear submarine, was a huge step.
Carrying ballistic missiles.
Initially, the shorter-range K-15 Sagarika. But they're developing longer-range SLBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, like the K-4 and future K-5. That really extends their reach and makes the second strike much more assured.
Still a work in progress, though.
It takes time to build up a fleet, establish continuous deterrent patrols, refine command and control. But it's clearly a top priority for ensuring long-term strategic stability.
And beyond the missiles themselves, India's investing in missile defense, BMD. How does that fit?
It's complex. The BMD program aims to create a shield against incoming missiles. You have systems like Pradyumna for high-altitude intercepts, Ashwin for lower altitude, plus the S-400 system from Russia adds another layer.
Sounds purely defensive.
On the surface, yes. But effective missile defense can upset the strategic balance. If one side feels immune, it might be tempted to strike first. Or it forces adversaries to build more offensive weapons or countermeasures to overwhelm the defense. It creates an offense-defense spiral, potentially.
So BMD affects the minimum deterrence calculation, too.
It absolutely can.
And the paper mentioned MIRVs again and other advanced tech, MARVs.
Right. MIRVs, as we said, multiply warheads per missile. MARVs, maneuverable re-entry vehicles, are warheads that can change direction as they approach the target, making them harder to intercept.
Evasive action.
Exactly. Plus, better guidance systems, decoys to fool defenses. It's all about ensuring that retaliation, if needed, gets through. Quality over just quantity, ensuring assured destruction capability.
All this tech development happens in a specific context, though. Regionally, that China-Pakistan nexus seems crucial.
It's a constant factor. Their close cooperation on nuclear and missile tech presents India with a potential two-front nuclear challenge.
Meaning India has to plan for both simultaneously?
Potentially, yes. Especially with projects like CPEC deepening their ties. India's response includes developing missiles that can reach all of China and building strategic partnerships with other countries like the US, Japan, Australia, partly to balance that nexus.
How does the doctrine itself, NFU especially, play into regional stability, given this backdrop, that stability-instability paradox?
Well, the theory behind NFU is that it should enhance crisis stability. If no one intends to strike first, there's less pressure to preempt in a crisis. It allows space for conventional conflict below the nuclear threshold.
Like Kargil or the surgical strikes.
Those are often cited as examples where conflicts occurred, but the nuclear threshold wasn't crossed. Restraint was shown, arguably because of the nuclear overhang in doctrines, but it's a dangerous game.
Depends on perception.
Hugely.
Yeah.
Does the adversary believe your NFU pledge? Do they understand your red lines? Miscalculation is always the big risk in that paradoxical space.
And globally, India's outside the big treaties, MPT, CPPT. How does its doctrine mesh with its diplomacy on these?
India argues the NPT is discriminatory, so it stays out. But it generally acts like a responsible non-proliferator. It hasn't signed the CTBT, but maintains its own testing moratorium since '98.
So acting as if bound by some rules.
In practice, yes. It supports negotiating a fissile material cutoff treaty, though with conditions about fairness. The Doctrine Minimum Deterrence, NFU, restraint, aligns with this diplomatic posture. It aims to show responsibility despite not being in the formal clubs.
And the 2008 NSG waiver, the civil nuclear deals, that was like the world acknowledging this unique position.
It was a major step, yes.
Yeah.
A kind of de facto recognition of India as a responsible nuclear state outside the NPT framework.
Okay, so looking forward, what are the really big challenges India's doctrine faces now? The paper highlights quite a few.
Several big ones. Technology's racing ahead. Hypersonic missiles. China, Russia are advanced. India's working on it too. Anti-satellite weapons. China has them. India demonstrated capability too. AI in military systems, quantum computing. These could change deterrence dynamics significantly.
Creating pressure to keep modernizing.
Constant pressure. Then there's a specific challenge from Pakistan's tactical nuclear weapons, the Nasser missile, and their full-spectrum deterrence idea. It directly challenges India's massive retaliation policy.
How does India respond to a battlefield nuke? That credibility gap again.
Exactly. It creates dilemmas. Do you stick to massive retaliation, develop smaller nukes yourself? It's a tough doctrinal puzzle. Cybersecurity is another huge one. Protecting command and control from hacking.
Can't have someone else triggering your system.
Or disabling them. Resilient air-gapped systems are vital. And finally, the shifting geopolitical landscape. The U.S.-India partnership, Quad, Aleutius, Russia's role. These all affect China's calculations, and thus India's.
Lots of moving parts.
Very complex. India needs to navigate all this carefully, maintain its deterrence, but also its strategic autonomy.
So it sounds like India's doctrine, built on restraint, faces a future where staying credible requires constant adaptation.
That sums it up well. It's a continuous balancing act, ensuring the deterrent is believable against evolving threats while sticking to responsible principles and the long-term goal of disarmament. Never easy.
So pulling it all together, India's nuclear path led to a doctrine emphasizing no first use and credible minimum deterrence, a posture of restraint. But it's facing serious, evolving challenges from new tech and regional dynamics.
Precisely. It's a carefully crafted stance, but its future effectiveness depends heavily on adapting strategically to a world that just won't sit still.
Right. And maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on, building on all this. With technology changing so fast, hypersonics, AI, cyber, how might the very definition of unacceptable damage change in the future? What does that mean for a doctrine like massive retaliation?
And maybe also, what role or responsibility do non-nuclear states have in this changing landscape? How can they influence the norms and behaviors surrounding nuclear deterrence going forward?
Excellent points. Definitely food for thought. For anyone wanting to dig deeper, the paper mentions looking into strategists like Subramanyam, Karnad Menon, or checking out current think tank analyses on Indian nuclear policy.
There's certainly a lot more to explore there.
Indeed. It's a conversation that's critical and ongoing. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive today.